I'd like to welcome you back to our study on Joseph. We're going to be continuing with part 3 today. In this part 3, we're going to be touching on some interesting topics, in my opinion, and getting into more Joseph's tunic, the next part of the story. And we'll probably, after this, get more into the actual story and focus less on this very beginning of the story of Joseph. But without further ado, the first things first, there likely was never a coat of many colors. Sorry, hate to burst your bubble, but now that it's done, take a deep breath and let's get on with what it more likely was and how it plays into prophecy. I know for many years, many generations of people have always talked about Joseph's coat of many colors. I know there's been Broadway's done about it, movies, books, etc., etc. But the reality is, it probably isn't a likely fact. In fact, when we get into the literal translation of the text, which we'll see in a moment, coat of many colors really doesn't play out. So, but before we get too much into the coat, there's another topic we need to touch on that's important in the overall picture, both of this tunic and the story of Joseph. In order for us to get into the next part of this wonderful story, we need to have a better understanding of birthrights. Why, you might ask? Well, because this is the story of Joseph. And what exactly is a birthright? Well, blessings and birthrights are not the same thing, as we'll see in this first passage. And so when we read through Scripture, for instance, Jacob blesses his 12 kids. There's 12 blessings, but there's only one birthright. We see later on Moses also blessing the 12 tribes, but there's still only one birthright, and that's important to keep in our mind. So in Genesis 27:36, we have this piece that kind of clears it up a little bit for us, directs us a little bit. Says, and he said, is not he rightly named Jacob? For he hath supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing. And he said, hast thou not reserved a blessing for me? And of course, we know this is Jacob's brother Esau that's talking. He was literally the person who was firstborn. He had the right for the birthright. But if we remember the story, he sold his birthright for some food because he came back from hunting, was really hungry. And his brother Jacob had been a good cook and made up some good food for him. Now, we see in the latter part, Jacob goes in to his father. His older brother, Esau, apparently, according to the story, was a very hairy man, at least in his arms and whatnot. And so Jacob puts on a skin of a goat on his arms and goes in to talk to his father, and gets his father to give him also the first blessing. And of course, it's an odd story. We know that in the end, it was the will of God that it happened this way. And of course, the question we have to ask is, was Jacob's father rebelling and not wanting to give Jacob the birthright and the blessing, or did it have to happen this particular way? And of course, in that story, we don't really have all the answers. But one thing is for certain, as we go through the story of Jacob and his kids, he seems more apt to listen, at least somewhat, to the influence of God, and place the birthright and the blessings as God designated. And that's pretty important, because we should be able to learn from the mistakes of those who have gone before us. So a birthright is the honor or privilege of the family's firstborn son. After the father would die, the firstborn son would assume the father's authority and responsibilities. In addition to assuming the leadership role in the family, the recipient of the birthright would inherit twice what was typically received by his brothers. In other words, if there was lands, if there was animals, whatever physical earthly possessions the father had, the son that received the birthright will receive a double portion. And so, of course, right away this calls our attention. Why are we talking about birthright if we're talking about Joseph? He was not the firstborn son. Well, let's get into this a little bit more and see a little bit more about it. Even though the birthright was typically given to the firstborn son, it could be revoked and given to another if there was proper justification, or in the case that the firstborn son's mother was a concubine or a slave, and therefore not legitimately in the line of what would be a birthright. And so, as in the case of Isaac, we know that he did have another brother who was older than him, but Abraham did not give the first birthright to the other one. He gave it to Isaac, and that's important because obviously the other child was born of a concubine. So typically the birthright included the succession of a throne. If one was involved, as in the case of a king, it typically included the rights of priesthood. And lastly, as already stated, it would have included a double portion of the inheritance. So these were the blessings of the birthright. So what does all this talk about birthright have to do with Joseph? Well, we go up into Chronicles, 1 Chronicles chapter 5, verse 1 and 2. And of course, it's important to note, Chronicles is quite a bit after Genesis. So this is well into our New Testament story. Now all of a sudden we have this piece of information coming out that we didn't see in the Genesis story, although likely it was there. But it doesn't really manifest, obviously, for us until all of a sudden in Chronicles. 1 Chronicles chapter 5, verse 1 and 2. Now the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, for he was the firstborn, but for as much as he defiled his father's bed, his birthright was given to the sons of Joseph, the son of Israel. And the genealogy is not to be reckoned after the birthright. For Judah prevailed above his brethren, and of him came the chief ruler. But the birthright was Joseph's. And so we have some important information coming in here. Number one, Reuben lost the birthright. And of course, I think that probably a lot of the things that we're seeing in the story of Joseph, even in the beginning, like we're going to talk about his tunic a little bit, likely were things that were pointing to events that would happen in the future. But nonetheless, we have this, that Reuben defiled himself and therefore lost the birthright. He did not lose a blessing. He was still blessed, but he lost the birthright. And the birthright was given not to Ephraim. I know if you do a little bit of study, you'll see a lot of people place the whole birthright on Ephraim, and that's not the case. The birthright was given to the sons of Joseph, plural, which is Ephraim and Manasseh. Yes, it is true, and this we will see as we go on. One of them received a larger portion of that birthright, but technically this birthright, in a very odd case, was split and given to the two sons. But as we mentioned, the birthright typically had the privilege of the kingship, and here we see in verse 2 that's not the case. Judah takes the kingship. Now the word prevailed here in this really almost has a meaning, something to the regards of maybe even a little underhandedly or something like that. It doesn't necessarily give you the idea of a legitimate passing of the inheritance of the kingship to Judah, but almost as if he took it by force. And knowing the story we have in the Old Testament, that wouldn't be a surprising thing. But one way or the other, Judah, and this also comes out in Jacob's blessing to Judah, he gets the kingships, and they are after his lineage, which of course we know that Jesus Christ himself came out of the line of Judah through David, etc., and was the last king physically of Israel. But even so, the birthright at this point, the rest of it is still focused on Joseph, and so that's very important to our story. So, knowing that Joseph got the birthright, does that make a little bit more sense why Joseph's brothers may have hated him? I mean, he was technically the 11th son, not the firstborn, although he was firstborn of Jacob's first choice for a wife, which brings us, of course, back to our story. And I think that when we're looking at the whole idea of the tunic, I think this tunic in some way was almost prophetic. And whether Jacob knew it or not, whether Joseph understood it or not, God did. And God is the one who is the master over all of this, and he's actually directing things even though we can't often see them. And so when we get back to our story in Genesis 37 and verse 3 and 4, we see this piece about the tunic. And now Israel loved Joseph more than all of his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. And when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all of his brethren, they hated him, and could not speak peaceably unto him. And so what we have here is a couple things coming into play. You have the 11th born son receiving the birthright as the firstborn son. You also have the 11th born son being set apart and treated different in many ways. And so his father comes and he gives him this coat. And as you can see in the text here, I've got of many colors scratched out, because I'm not sure that that's actually what is really meant in this passage. Very likely this coat of many colors had more prophetic implication, and of course many colors is not actually part of what was really there. And so if we go back to the original Hebrew and we pull out the literal translation of this passage, what do we find? And in that very spot we find, and he made him a long coat reaching to his feet, which is very interesting. There's no coat of many colors in the original Hebrew anywheres. It's just talking about a long coat, and the idea of a long coat here, which again we'll see a little bit more as we continue, indicates something that comes down to the wrists and down to the ankles. The Hebrew words here are kethoneth pas or ketonet pasim, which is typically a long skirt-like garment, usually of linen, a very high quality linen, reaching to the palms and the soles of the feet. Now, one of the reasons of linen, typically in this area where Jacob lived, the majority of the people were wearing wool or garments made of wool. But when you got up into the higher aristocrats, you had people getting out of the wool, which was considered a poor man's cloth, and getting into linen, and even in some very rare cases, silks. And so this actual passage here actually depicts a very specific type of garment that most likely and most usually was of linen. And it actually depicts more than this in the very words themselves. Where did the idea of the coat of many colors come? The idea that Joseph's coat had many colors came from a mistranslation of the Septuagint. The English translation of the Septuagint by Lancelot C.L. Brenton translates Genesis 37:3 as we've read it, as follows: "And Jacob loved Joseph more than all of his sons, because he was to him the son of his old age, and made for him a coat of many colors." This translation was then adopted in the Latin Vulgate by Jerome, and then later by the King James Bible. They followed suit, translating the Hebrew words as coat of many colors, just because that was, what people had already gotten the feeling of. And so, but if we go back and even if we look at other translations that have now went back and looked more at the Hebrew, different translations, different Bibles, we have the NRSV, a long robe with sleeves. Of course, the King James, a coat of many colors. The NIV, a richly ornamented robe. The CJB, a long sleeve robe. The NAB, a long tunic. The NJB, a decorated tunic. And so most of the other versions are actually moving away from the idea of many colors, because literally in the original Hebrew it's not there. It could be technically implied to some degree, but it's a very, very minor understanding when you think of many colors in this word usage. The basic word usage actually has a different direction, typically speaking. And there's another spot that uses these same words that might give us some insight, and let's have a look at that one to see if it can give us some clues. So we're going to be reading in 2 Samuel 13:18 through 19, because while there's only these two spots, the one in Genesis and this one in Samuel, this one in Samuel actually gives us a little bit more insight, and there's actually some historicity behind this in the way this is presented. Now, the first rendering I have here is taken from the literal Hebrew translation. Not from the King James. After this, we'll read the King James one. But the literal translation, again, for this passage is, "And bolt the door after her, and on her was a long tunic, for thus used to wear the daughters of the kings who were virgin robes, or they were robes that were for virgins, and brought her his attendant outside, and bolted the door after her, and took Tamar ashes on her head, and tore the long tunic that was on her, and put her hand on her head, and left, going on and crying out. And so this is the story of Tamar. And of course, if we remember the story of Tamar, this is David's daughter. She is a virgin daughter of a king. As it is given here, she's got a special robe on. This robe is called a long tunic, and it's a long tunic that's designated, or symbolically, if someone saw this outfit, they would understand she's a daughter of the king, and she's still chaste. And so we have, again, in both of these passages, in the literal Hebrew, the idea of a long tunic. And now we jump into the King James, and we see that, again, this one passage was changed. And she had a garment of diverse colors upon her, for with such robes were the king's daughters that were virgins apparelled. Then his servant brought her out, and bolted the door after her. And Tamar put ashes on her head, and rent her garment of diverse colors that was on her, and laid her hand on her head, and went on crying. And so we have, very important here in these two passages, I know a lot of people begin to try to bring out all kinds of symbology and why the coat of many colors was important for Joseph. But the reality is the symbolism that they're trying to apply in this robe of many colors on Joseph would then have to apply for Tamar, apply to Tamar also. And that really doesn't fit. Rather, if we look at the outfit that Joseph's wearing as one for designating the birthright, royalty, things of that nature, this is a king's child, this is a chaste person, then this outfit actually begins to have a little bit more reasonable meaning for us. So the literal rendering of 2 Samuel 13:18 gives us another angle, that the words used to describe both Tamar's tunic and Joseph's tunic were a typical robe used to denote an unmarried or a chaste virgin royalty. And that's rather interesting. Thus we can see the tunic would have been emblematic of Jacob's giving the birthright to Joseph. There's a leadership that is being given to Joseph. Literally, the kingship, even though we understand that Judah took the lineage of kings, nonetheless, the birthright, the kingship, was still given to Joseph. And there are those in some circles that talk about, when we get into the idea of the Messiah ben David and the Messiah ben Joseph, that one day some of these attributes, like the priesthood and others that were given to others of Joseph's sons, will be retaken back onto Joseph. And that's an interesting piece in this whole prophecy, especially if we think about the two dreams that we went over in the first two studies, where, it symbolically, in some simple way, Joseph's brothers were kneeling to him, and he was above them in status to some type, in some way. And so also, if this pertains to Jesus in some way, then we can see that all of this is very emblematic, because he will, even though he is born of the 12 tribes, of the tribe of Judah, he will dominate over all the tribes, and that's very important. And as we will see, he will also get the double portion. So I suspect, and it's in my opinion, that the robe that Joseph and Tamar were wearing has already been described to some extent in other locations. One of those could be in Joseph Smith's second visitation testimony. And I just think that probably in this and a couple more of the passages we're going to read very likely give us an understanding, a little bit of what Joseph's robe more likely would have looked like. It says here, and he had a loose robe of exquisite whiteness. It was a whiteness beyond anything earthly I had ever seen. Nor do I believe any earthly thing could be made to appear so exceedingly white and brilliant. His hands were naked, so the robe comes down to his hands. His arms also a little above the wrist, so it comes right down to his hands. So also were his feet naked, as were his legs a little above the ankles. So the robe comes down to his ankles, just a little bit above his ankles. And his head and neck were also bare. So it's a white robe, symbolic of chastity, saintliness, etc. and it comes down to just a little above your wrists, just a little above your ankles. Another spot that likely describes the robe might be in Revelations 1:13. And this actually points to Jesus himself. And in the midst of the candlesticks, one like unto the Son of Man, clothed with a garment down to the foot, girt about by paps with a golden girdle. And so again, we have this special gown that's being brought out. It's talking about the Son of Man, which points to Jesus Christ. And this comes right down to the feet with a golden belt around the waist. Also in Revelations 19:8, I think we have some symbolism being brought in. And to her was granted that she should be arrayed in fine linen, clean and white, for the fine linen is the righteousness of the saints. And so again, we have a couple pieces being brought in, the idea of this whiteness, this idea of purity. And again, here we're seeing linen, which is most likely what this outfit Joseph was wearing was made out of. The words used, as I said in that passage, denote that possibility. And this is symbolism of the righteousness of the saints. And through the story, we can see that Joseph obviously had a little bit more spirituality than his brothers, and that's important as it's brought out. And of course, we know Jesus Christ in the end, when he came as perfect, clean, and white. That's how he was able to die on the cross for our sins. All of these passages give us an idea of purity, chastity, and saintly, which was likely the idea with the design of the robe, thus making Joseph appear more holy or special than his brothers, which was likely part of the friction between them. And then added the dreams on top of that, and it was a disaster waiting to happen. You had this younger brother, the 11th of brothers, appearing more holy than thou, so to speak. And it didn't help when Dad gave him a robe that seemed to indicate all of this every time they looked at it. So this brings us back to one of the main questions then. Did Joseph ever manifest the birthright? So he was given the birthright. He's got this outfit that seems emblematic of the birthright, but did he ever really manifest it? Did his tribes, through Ephraim and Manasseh, take over the position of Jacob? Is it a prophetic thing yet to happen, or are these verses really just symbols pointing to the Messiah ben Joseph and the second coming of Christ? And I don't know that I have answers for all of those, except that I know that this robe is very important in pointing to all of these things. Okay, as we know, as we stated early, that the birthright has basically three parts to it: the gift of the rulership, the gift of the priesthood, the gift of a double portion. And obviously, if you're thinking at all about Christ, you know that all of these hit him. He is the last king. He is also the last high priest, and he gets a double portion. He gets the house of Israel. He also gets the Gentile church. The two difference, the olive tree and the wild olive tree, coming together and grafted together in one grand inheritance. We know that Judah retained the kingship in the physical sense of things, and we know the priesthood was given to the sons of Aaron and Levi. But will these things come back into Joseph? Well, again, we know that the priesthood in the New Testament is called after the order of Christ, or in another terminology, after the order of Melchizedek, and that's important because that's giving us the kingship being taken back to Christ, the priesthood, no longer the Levitical and Aaronic priesthood, but now the priesthood after Christ, and finally the two great double portions of what God was giving them. And of course, this in Genesis 35, we have this promise of the double portion given to Joseph. In this part, it's actually being given to Jacob, but this is the birthright that was passed down. Genesis 35:11. And God said unto him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall be of thee, and kings shall come out of thy loins. And so we have two pieces to this, and we know that this was given directly to Ephraim and Manasseh when Joseph brought his two kids to Jacob, and Jacob passed his name on to them. And of course, he tells them, specifically when he's blessing Ephraim, he says, let my name be on him. And of course, we know as we continue in the Old Testament, from that point on, we begin to see, especially after the 12 tribes split, and the 10 tribes went north. The 2 tribes stayed south, more or less. Often you have the words Israel, speaking of the 10 tribes, and Ephraim, speaking of the 10 tribes to the north, being together and used in the same sense. And so you have this whole idea that rulership was being taken, even though in Jerusalem, of the lineage of Judah, was reigning the kings. And that's important to think about. And a nation and a company of nations, a split. And so you're going to have the house of Israel, a nation, and a company of nations. You're going to have all the Gentile nations that come in and become part of the gospel of Jesus Christ, being then manifest in Ephraim and Manasseh. In the spiritual sense, being, because you always have 2 pieces to this. You have the physical sense and the spiritual sense that begin to play together. You have the church, and you have all, the basic church, and then you have all these other believers that have truly believed and served Jesus Christ, even though they may not yet have come into the church. Because, of course, we know in 3 Nephi chapter 10, God sends out his people still to bring in the rest of the people that are not in at this time. So this kind of wraps up our part on the tunic of Joseph. I hope this kind of has opened up some new thoughts, some new ideas in your mind, and I hope that this blesses you. God bless and have a wonderful day.